New year, new edition of the London Free Press podcast, our first one of 2021, hoping that 2021 is a little bit better year than 2020 for most of the folks who are listening. And for our first episode of the year, thrilled to be joined by London Free Press journalist Dale Carruthers, who's been covering the events in Aylmer, which continue to be events, and he's on the podcast with us today. Dale, thank you very much for doing this.
Craig, it's good to be back.
Let's talk about what's happening in Aylmer, because people hear Aylmer and now, and I know that officials there have talked about it. You hear the name of the town of Aylmer and you're thinking to yourself, oh, okay, we're going to have to go through another whole thing about what's going on with masks and this weird church and all this stuff. So there is some new stuff happening surrounding this legal advocacy group that is representing this church in Aylmer. So give us the very latest in the story. What's happening there, Dale?
Okay, so the latest out of Aylmer is the Church of God has been holding its drive-in services since the spring. And in the spring, they weren't allowed to under the emergency rule. And the Canadian Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms made a charter challenge, and the Ontario government amended the law and said drive-in services would be allowed under certain conditions. So that was kind of a victory for the Church of God. Since then, they've been holding these drive-in services, and then on December 27th, they held one, and a group of protesters gathered outside the church, stayed in their vehicles on the road, lined up, and started protesting them. And they ended up calling the police during the drive-in service, saying people had gotten out of their vehicles, which isn't allowed. So the police came, and they ended up charging the pastor's son, Herbert Hildebrandt, with hosting a gathering exceeding the permitted number of people. And then he was later charged with some criminal offenses too, related to an alleged altercation involving a police officer. So this last Sunday, they held another drive-in service, and the protesters returned along with a group of counter demonstrators. So the protesters are pro-public health protesters, and they're saying we need to take this pandemic seriously. And they're thinking the church is not doing that. They think that Pastor Henry Hildebrandt, who has become a featured speaker at these anti-restrictions rallies, is encouraging people to not listen to public health guidelines. So they were protesting that. And on Sunday, about 30 cars lined the road. And the only major incident is when one man tried to storm onto church property and confront church officials. He later told me he wasn't affiliated with the protesters or the counter demonstrators, but he was just there to air grievances he had against the church. So a little bit of everything happening up there in Aylmer these days.
Yeah, it seems like quite a bit. Tell me about these protests. I know you've seen some of them yourself and covered some of them yourself. Some people might say, "Hey, wait a minute! If the people who are protesting are against the church having gatherings, aren't they gathering to protest? Is there a difference between what you might see with the car service and the people who are protesting just off the property?"
Yeah, that's something I've heard before. So let's go back to the anti-lockdown protests. Those are people protesting the government measures to curb the spread of COVID-19. Those have traditionally always drawn counter demonstrators who come out to demonstrate against these anti-restrictions protests, and they do it by wearing masks and maintain some social distancing in some cases, not always. And so this was the same thing. These demonstrators stayed in their vehicles and wore masks in their vehicles, kind of to make their point. So they did it safely, is what they said. And of course, if they got out of their vehicles and gathered, they could be charged under the Reopening Ontario Act, which prohibits outdoor gatherings of over 10 people.
Yeah, there's certainly that part of it as well, and it just seems like it's been a bizarre series of events. You mentioned there are some criminal charges here, so there's that to consider. This church continues to make headlines. As far as you can tell, the folks of the church plan to continue to have these services, though, right? That's not going anywhere.
That's correct. I spoke with Pastor Hildebrandt, and he says that the drive-in services will continue. And church officials were working really hard on Sunday to ensure that all the rules were followed. Nobody got out of their vehicles, none of the churchgoers that I saw. They have almost a dozen security staffers going around to make sure everyone stays in their vehicles, making sure the protesters stay off their property. And police were watching the whole thing, and they later said that there were no violations that day during the drive-in service. So the church feels as though they found a way that they can do these services safely, and they're going to continue doing that, because to them, gathering on Sunday is an essential part of life. So that's their plan.
What do we know about the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom? I know that this church isn't the only one they're representing. So what can you tell us about that organization?
So they're a civil liberties organization, and they represent people typically pro bono. They take donations when they feel their charter rights have been violated. So like I said, in the past, they took on a case on behalf of the church to challenge the government's ban of drive-in services, and they were successful. So they're also representing church leaders in Leamington, Windsor, Chatham, Kent. There's been about a dozen church leaders charged under the Reopening Ontario Act for hosting church services either indoor or outdoor, in which case the police said rules were broken. So they've laid these charges. So the Justice Center is representing all of these individuals pro bono. They said there'll be more. And they said their challenge will be based on the fact that these charges violate people's charter rights, and the government needs to explain why they took these extraordinary measures to take away people's rights in this situation. And we'll find out a little more as these cases start working their way through the courts. Nobody's even had a first appearance yet. So the Justice Center said they're just waiting on getting disclosure from the Crowns kind of to see what the cases look like. And we'll know a little bit more about that in the future. But they're very determined. They like taking high profile cases like this. So this is what they do.
Yeah, it seems to be right up their alley then. So as they continue to make these challenges here, do we think that some of the restrictions might let up on this church? Are they perhaps waiting for restrictions to be let up maybe in the springtime once we have more people getting the vaccination, the weather's a little bit better? What does the future look like from Henry Hildebrand's perspective?
Church leaders I've spoken with are really hopeful that the restrictions will be eased in the future. Right now, you can only have 10 people inside or outside for a religious service, and then drive-in services are allowed. So 10 people really isn't enough for any sort of religious service. So these officials at places of worship are really hopeful that that'll be one of the first thing the government eases. And I guess we'll just have to see if that happens. There's no telling where this whole situation is going to go at this point.
What are people in the community outside of that church community saying to you about this? The fact that this church and this pastor continue to make headlines?
I'd say it's a pretty divisive issue in the community. Some people support the church, even people who aren't members. They really support what Pastor Hildebrand's doing, kind of being critical of the government's response to COVID-19 and the restrictions put in place. That's drawn a lot of support from outside Aylmer as well. You see a lot of people from the greater Toronto area coming in to attend these church services and to attend the anti-lockdown rallies in Aylmer. So there's a lot of out-of-town support. There's a lot of support in town from outside the church as well. Then on the flip side, there's a lot of people from Aylmer who say Hildebrand, the church, are giving the town a black eye. They're putting them in the headlines, making them look bad. I spoke with the pro-public health rally organizer, Rain Jelenot, and she said she had organized these rallies outside of the Church of God, and she'll continue to do so because she wants to send a message that the town doesn't support the church. And she says that it's going to keep going, the protests will get bigger, and so she's not ready to back down. She's been the subject of online threats and intimidation. So it just shows how divisive this issue is in the community. Tensions can run high at these protests between the demonstrators and the counter demonstrators. There's not a lot of common ground between the two sides, and they don't really listen to each other. They're there to make their point, and that's about it. They're not there to listen. So I've seen quite a few arguments, a few minor physical confrontations. We didn't see them that Sunday, but I'm talking about the past anti-lockdown rallies. So Aylmer is really kind of a microcosm of the tension between people who agree with the COVID-19 restrictions and people who don't in Ontario, really.
Yeah, certainly. And I definitely get it. It's kind of like a really, an intense version of it. Before we wrap up here, Dale, the church leadership and the church goers, there's the confrontations and things along those lines. But as you said, no one's really listening to anybody there, right? So it's not as though the protesters are going to one day make the church leadership or the people who are in the congregation say, you know what, maybe we're not going to have the church service this week. It doesn't appear to bother them on that level. They don't want them on the property and they don't want them to be physical, but it doesn't really bother them that way, the fact there's a protest across the street.
Exactly. Every time I write on this issue, I read the online comments, tracks hundreds of online comments, and you just see how divided people are in this issue in the online comments. A lot of name calling, anger. Like I said, these demonstrators and counter demonstrators aren't trying to convince each other. It's almost like they're going to battle. One guy wrote, one of the supporters of the church, he's not affiliated with the church. He just is anti-restrictions demonstrator, comes to Aylmer, let's get ready to rumble. That was his Facebook post, paraphrase before. And I think that really sums up the attitude of a lot of people who go to this. It's like they're going into battle, if not physical, with words, with signs to make their point. It's a battle out there.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, I'll paraphrase a line from Dazed and Confused. I came to this service to sing hymns and kick butt, and I'm all out of hymns, It just feels as though people are going in there literally looking for a brawl, and that's kind of I know, Dazed and Confused quotes. I didn't see that coming, but that's kind of the attitude that people seem to have with this thing, right? Is they're looking for a fight. So if there's a bunch of people that go into a space and they're all looking to fight, eventually I think something ugly might happen, right?
Yeah, and I should stress, it's not the Church of God congregants. They're all there for their Sunday service. That's their priority. But there's this other group of people who have kind of latched on to the Church of God and are using it to raise the profile of their cause. And then the counter demonstrators who come out, those are the ones who are really divided. And I think I said before, last time I was on this show, there's definitely hostility towards the media. Again, there on Sunday. Myself and some colleagues, you literally get surrounded by some of these people, and they're accusing you of not reporting the facts, of hiding the truth about COVID, and all these other accusations. And you try and reason with them. I do sometimes. Sometimes you get a little upset with them because they're not listening to what you say. But again, it just goes to show the divide out there right now with everything that's happening.
Yeah, that divide is definitely real and definitely exists. It's all the time we've got. Dale, thank you so much for coming on and giving us the very latest on what's going on with the Church of God story. Thank you for reporting on this, and we'll talk to you very soon.
Right on. Thanks, Craig. Have a good one.
It's Dale Carruthers, London Free Press reporter, here on the London Free Press podcast, which you can subscribe to on Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, the entirety of the podcast spectrum. If you would do that, we'd very much appreciate it, and continue to appreciate the positive reviews as well. All the time we have for this episode. We'll have another episode later in the week, so please continue to listen to the London Free Press podcast. We will talk to you next time.